to another episode of The Meta. I'm your host, Jay Larson, and joining me this week, we have a very special guest, Dustin Olson. Hello, Dustin. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How you doing, Jay?
Uh, I'm I'm pretty great. Uh, Dustin, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right. So I'm based out of Salt Lake City, and I have played in the VTC the last two times. I've done fairly well locally with Convergence. I've been playing since Mark II, but really went really hard into it with the changeover to Mark III, and have been playing Convergence and Crucible Guard almost exclusively. So I really love the limited factions. That's kind of my wheelhouse. Even though I do own several other factions, they actually never see the table.
So, what's a little? Give us a little bit about your gaming history and history with playing War Machine.
Okay, so I've played, like I said, in the VTC a couple of times, and then locally I've done well with steamrollers and just like statewide tournaments, like the Salt Lake Gaming Convention and the Intermountain Cup. I've done well there as well, but I haven't had the chance much to travel for War Machine, which I'm hoping once things get back to normal with COVID, I will actually be able to start traveling around a little bit more and playing in some conventions.
So, how long have you been playing War Machine, and what got you interested in it?
So I started playing war games in high school, playing with Games Workshop games, and then I saw this War Machine at my local game club or shop, and was really interested in the models. And then when the Convergence faction got released, it just like hooked me. The Art Deco style, I really loved it. So I started buying the models, and then I was kind of toeing the line, playing both game systems for a while. But with the change to Mark III and some of the things that Games Workshop did around that same time frame, like moving to Age of Sigmar over Fantasy, I decided that it was time to hang up the towel for that game and go full into War Machine. So I've been playing pretty consistently all through Mark III and a little bit during Mark II, but really it was the release of Convergence that got me into to come over to Privateer Press's games.
So, have you been happy with Convergence overall?
I think there was a good brick of time where I was not very happy with them. That's actually why I bought into Crucible Guard. I like the limited factions, and so I had most interest playing them. The big stretch where they Convergence didn't get looked at, being the limited faction for several years. I think between when the Conflux released and I guess when Orion came out, that big span of time where they were not getting looked at, not getting any kind of new things for them was pretty hard to stay motivated to keep playing. I think they've kind of learned their lesson with that. As you can see now, the limited factions actually still receive updates and model entries, just not as frequently as everyone else. But before that kind of gap, it was a couple of years where it was literally nothing, and that kind of was hard as a Convergence player. And I bought into Crucible Guard to kind of get that diversity, but then they started applying the new approach, I guess, to Convergence as well. So I've gone back to Convergence since then, and it's been great. They're definitely my favorite faction.
All right. Well, to go over again the format of the podcast, we will have a conversation with each other for about 45 or 50 minutes in the main episode, and then we'll have a bonus episode that'll be about the same length for the people who are supporting the Patreon. And we'll start off with questions from the community, and then if we get through all those, I'll have some for you as well. So first off, we have some questions from Imperial, a local to you.
Yep.
He says, first off, what's your impressions of the new TEP? And the TEP is the abbreviation for the battle engine that Convergence has had for a long time.
The Transfinite Emergence Projector.
Yes.
And that's a mouthful. So TEP for short. So I think the TEP is okay. It's not the horror it used to be. I remember the days when it was the only good battle engine. I think with the increase of lethality of the game, and extreme threat ranges. Being able to walk 5 and spray 10 is a hard ask for a 16-point model. They have gotten better, obviously, with the additional boxes and the point reduction. I don't know that they're in line to be a great battle engine, but they're definitely not bad. They're probably fairly middle of the pack, I think, as far as battle engines go now.
His follow-up question with it is, which caster would you choose to run with them?
I would definitely run them with Orion or Aurora 1. Aurora 1's feat of being able to repo them is going to help get them 2 turns of shooting before they die. They're still pretty easy to kill, even with their servitors. You get anything to melee with them, and they're going to die. And if you have to be within a 10-inch spray, that's in charge distance of most anything that in the game that's going to be seeing the table. So you really want to get that distance with Aurora 1 that you can do with her feet. I'm not sure that you're going to love them there because Aurora 1 has so many other things that she wants to run, but it's definitely a possibility. That's probably where I'd put them, or with Orion, because he increases their lethality so much that maybe it doesn't matter that it's in range of other things, because hopefully you'll kill all the things that can get to your battle engine. Those 2 are probably your best bet. Axis would be okay as well with his feet. But again, I think he kind of suffers the same thing Aurora does. I just don't know if that's the best choice for 16 points in his list. So probably one of those 3 is where I would put him.
I guess a quick follow-up question. It feels like Axis is kind of like one of the last man standing casters with one of the kind of old school powerhouse feats.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that statement, first off?
Yes, absolutely. I think Axis has one of the strongest feats in the game, and he is definitely the old school style of legitimately shutting down your opponent's turn with the no run, charge, trample, power attacks on his feet, in addition to the strength and speed bonus he gives your own side. It's very potent feat.
So with that said, how much is Axis currently making it into one of your list pairings?
Not very often, actually. I think that he runs a similar list idea that Aurora 2 and Aurora 1 want to run, and because of how the flight and Strange Bedfellows works, they're probably the better choice. It's not that Axis is not good. It's just that the Strange Bedfellows is so strong, and the Auroras run a very similar style of list. I don't think I'd want to run an Aurora and Axis pairing. There's probably ways that you could do it, but generally speaking, the Axis list and Aurora list are accomplishing kind of the same thing, and so you just go with Aurora.
Yeah, I thought that was likely kind of the case, which is kind of I guess on the one hand it's a little bit sad to see some of the older casters get kind of relegated, but also it can be exciting to see new stuff have its day in the sun. So
yeah, I think if you want to play Axis, you can definitely put them in a competitive pair. It's just you're not going to put them in a pair with Aurora, I don't think. So if you wanted to run, say, Orion, and Axis is a great pair to go with Orion, but not so much the Auroras, which are kind of the bays at the moment.
All right, so next question from Imperial. He says, why don't you share more pictures of your conversions?
So this is one of my locals, and he's seen a lot of the conversions I do. So I've done quite a bit of converting and modifying my models, both with my Convergence and with my Crucible Guard. And I like them, and I put a lot of work into doing some pretty cool modifications, but I don't think my paint job is quite up to snuff with my converting. And so I get, I guess, anxious about sharing photos with them online. Like, I'll give an example of something I've done. My Vulcan, instead of having the bottom train section, has like giant octopus tentacles instead. And his cannon on his shoulder, rather than being a little derpy thing, is actually a pretty massive cannon. And I think it looks really great. And obviously my locals like it, but I just don't feel like my paint job is quite up to snuff to be touting it online.
Final question from Imperial. He says, wouldn't it be swell if Directrix got Disintegration?
Yes, that would be very swell. I would love it if Disintegration was on Directrix's card. Directrix has many issues, and that would solve some of them. I think so. I have some hard opinions about things, and Directrix is one of them. I believe that it's best for the community and for Privateer Press if we don't try to sugarcoat things when they're not good, when they're not performing well. And so I'm pretty blunt with people on the online. Sometimes I don't think Directrix is good. I've gotten in over probably 100 games with her trying to make her work, and she's just not there. And I maybe rub people the wrong way when they try to be building a list with Directrix, and I just tell them that they should play Orion or play someone who's better.
So before the update, Peter Lippert used to play a fair bit of Iron Mother and played her mainly as a War Machine drop.
Yep.
And he said that after the update, it seemed like she was even stronger in the style of list that he had been playing with her. So what are your thoughts on why you think that she has some issues?
So I think Peter Lippert is actually an extremely good player. I've talked to him about Directrix a half dozen times, and he has done some good stuff with her. So I don't mean to say that he hasn't.
Sure, yeah.
I think her main issue is her game plan only is applicable to a very narrow subset of lists, right? It's only good into War Machine, and it's only good into Warjack Heavy War Machine. And that would be fine if she had a great game plan, which she doesn't. She has an okay game plan into a very narrow subset of the field. Her spell list is okay, and her feat is bad. I think she has the bottom 10% of feats in the game, easily the worst feat in Convergence. I think the effectively getting +3 Mat and +2 Rat for a feat is pretty abysmal, especially when it comes at the cost of the rest of the time you're Mat 5, Rat 6. I think that's her main issue, is both her spell list and her feat are lackluster, and there's nothing really else on her card that is making up for it. Her little servitors, they're quite great, and her gun is pretty good. So those are like I think the two saving graces on her. I think if you're playing Directrix, you really need to leverage those Imperil bots, and you want her to be using her gun. I think overall, though, like I said, it's just she's got such a narrow game plan, and it only applies to a small portion of the game, and it's not even great. It's not even like it's a slam dunk into those matches. Into those matches, you have a good game, and in everyone else, you have a bad game. So why would I take someone that has 80-20, like 80% of the times I'm just going to lose, and 20% of the times I can play a game, when I can take someone who's statistically just going to perform better?
All right, so our next set of questions are from BCCB. First off, he says, how do you feel Convergence was affected by the 2021 update?
I think that they did a good job with Convergence by and large. I think there's a couple of misses. The one thing I didn't really love was, I'll probably get into this a little bit later, but Strange Bedfellows took quite a few different nerfs, and some of them were quite deserved. But I think in aggregate, not that it affected Strange Bedfellows too much, but the necessary nerfs for Strange Bedfellows adversely affects the other lists that Convergence can make. So some examples of that are Bloodthirst on Asphyxious. While I 100% agree that it was something in Strange Bedfellows having those extreme threat ranges was something that needed to go, Clockwork Legions really needs that speed buff, and so does Destruction Initiative. It really helped them get their slower things to the fight, but because Strange Bedfellows was going too far, we also lost that benefit from the list that actually needed that. So I think overall pretty good. I do want Directrix and Syntherian to get looked at. I wish that they would have got time. And Faye mentioned that she wanted to give them time to look at them. more thoroughly when she did they were part of the casters that she had stated she wasn't going to be able to fix with the update, and wanted to go on a second pass and really put some time into some of these casters. But with her leaving, we'll see who picks up that mantle, and hopefully they get a look at Directrix and Syntharian.
What are some? I played Convergence when they first released, and I always felt like Syntharian was a caster who had, I guess, issues.
Yeah.
And usually it felt like there was an opportunity cost taking him compared to some of the other casters. But what are some of the things, I guess, what do you see as the issues with him, or what are some things that you think could potentially be done to make him more viable?
So I think when you look at the design philosophy of the limited factions now, it's the casters are very, like, take Crucible Guard or Grymkin. The casters are very distinct and separate feeling. I think the biggest issue right now with Syntharian and Directrix is they feel like they shared the same game plan as other casters. So Syntharian is just a worse version of Locke, and Directrix is a worse version of Orion. I think that there's an overlap there, and with a limited faction of only having 7 casters, you can't really afford to have that. And between those, I think Orion as a gunline caster is infinitely better than Directrix, and Locke is just a superior version of what Syntharian tries to do. I think that's probably their biggest problem. I don't know that there's like an easy fix, like, oh, just give them X spell and they'll be better.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably fundamentally they need to be redesigned, both of them. I would like to see them just try something new. I think that Directrix kind of tries to play like a spell slinging type of game. I wish they would just move more into that, not so much try to push her into kind of a pseudo ranged area, but just move her into a strong spell slinging caster. And then with Syntharian, they could do many things with where they could take them. They could take them to be more supporting of the Jacks in like a defensive manner, whereas Locke is very offensive in what she does. That could be interesting. But I just feel like there is that overlap between those two pairs of casters, and Locke and Orion are just better.
So you mentioned a little bit about Convergence being the first limited faction, and you enjoying the limited factions in general. How does Convergence feel to you as the first designed limited faction compared to as they kind of continued this process with Grymkin and Crucible Guard? What sort of differences do you feel there are in those factions?
Well, I think the biggest thing was what I was just saying about the casters feel very different. They have a very niche role that they fill, and there's not a lot of overlap. Like, you take the Defiers and the Old Witch, they do not feel similar to each other. They all have a very different game plan and can use the pieces that they have to do it very well. Even the Infernal Masters is a good example. They are very clearly different. I think it's just a product of the times of when they were designed, and I think they have gotten much better with the CID that they received, and then with the update just recently even helped even more. They're in a really good position, and they have benefited from what they've learned about making these limited factions. But previous to that, like I said, in that time period kind of between when they released and when they kind of got their CID, there's some time in there that they felt very outdated models. I do like the limited factions because they're easy to collect, and their mechanics that they have are interesting because they're built to be only applicable, to the smaller section of the game, unlike things that you put into Signar or Circle of Orboros, where it could apply to so many more models. So you could have more powerful mechanics within the faction, like induction in Convergence, or the what are they called? The Grymkin's not Trump. What are they? Arcana. The Arcana that Grymkin can do. Like, that's a really cool mechanic that you can explore within the limited faction space that maybe wouldn't be such a good idea to do with some of the primary huge factions.
Especially as they continued making the limited factions, it felt like they were pretty conscious about asking themselves what the role is for various models within the limited faction and what its reason for existing is and what they're wanting it to achieve. And Convergence was the first limited faction, and it came out in Mark II, and there were a fair number of models that it felt to me that there wasn't much of a reason for them to see the table, and then we went through to the Mark III update, and you would read through War Room, and there were a fair number of entries, it felt like, where you would read through them and you'd be like, I just really can't really see any list where I would ever think that I'm going to put this unit or this model in the list.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you feel like the update shook that up any? Are there many models that previously they just really didn't have a home anywhere, and now since the update they're potentially interesting to look at in certain lists?
Yeah, so I think the big winner of that category would be the Monitor. I think the Monitor before was a pretty awful jack. For those of you that don't know, it's the one that shoots the saw blades. It used to be a rate of fire 1. That's all it did. You got to shoot the one saw blade at a POW 13, and it was like a 16-point jack. And then its up close melee potential was also not very good. It's POW strength 17. Its big selling point was True Sight, which you can get from an objective, but it was up there with the most expensive jacks in the faction. Now it's 13 points. It's got Ricochet on its Sawflinger as well. It's way better. Those changes coming down in price and then getting it so it can potentially pass up to 3 focus with your induction chain is huge. I think it is probably the biggest winner from the Convergence side of things for the most recent update. I think there's some other things that are still lagging behind. I think overall the point drops on the jacks was pretty good, but probably the most fundamental change would be that. And I don't remember if the Cypher's blast damage change, I think that was actually during the CID, but that was another big one. Before, its blast damage was like a POW 6, and like even against chaff, even against the weakest things, that's still only killing half of the time. So that was pretty awful. So that got changed actually during the CID though. But that was also another good change that made a big difference, I think, for the Cypher.
All right, so next question from BCCB. He says, where would you rank Convergence among the game's factions?
I'd rank it probably towards the top. I don't think it's top tier #1 faction anymore, but since the Strange Bedfellows nerfs, I do think that it is still very good. I don't think anyone would be surprised to see it win any kind of major event or anything. But I think that can be said about probably most factions. I think that the game is really well balanced right now. And it feels like any faction can be taken to a major convention and win and do really well. So I really love that. I put them towards the top still though, maybe top half. I don't know that they're top 10% or anything, but I think they're in a really good position.
Okay, so next question from BCCB. He says, what are Convergence's greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses as a faction?
I think its greatest strength is its heavy jacks. I think they are amazing. I think that they each have a pretty good role and they can each do really well. Also, having Strange Bedfellows as a way to get friendly faction Void Archons, friendly faction Hermit, things like that. The friendly faction clause in Strange Bedfellows, I think, is extremely good. It makes lists have a lot more viability, and then also having that option for taking more than just the one Merc slot as well is probably one of the greatest strengths. Negation Angels are obviously really good. The Tesselators, both Auroras, Orion are probably all things I'd put in the strengths. The weaknesses we don't really have a good screening unit, or there are issues with Clockwork Legions, is I guess what I should say, and the obstructors and reductors, that the smaller based guys that are probably in the category of why would you ever put them on the table? They're just not going to work out. I also think that the recursion mechanic within the game as a whole is pretty weak right now. I think that there are too many answers with RFP. That a good portion of Convergence is dedicated to having this idea of a reconstructing army, and it rebuilds itself. But that's just not good right now. It's just not a viable game plan. And so that's probably one of the weaknesses. And then I think there's a couple of casters and a couple of solos that are really behind the curve and that fall into the category of I would just not play them. They're just not good. So I would put the Steel Soul Protector in that category, Enigma Foundries in that category. Some of the servitors, I think having them all Mat 5, Rat 5 is really not good. It makes them pretty bad, honestly. And then we have, like I said, Directrix and Centurion that I just have issues with. I'd put them down as weaknesses as well. And it's like when you have a main faction and you have a couple of casters that aren't great, it's not like a really big deal. But when you only have 7 and 2 of them are bad, that's more of an issue.
So that ties in a little bit to the next question. BCCB asks, how do you maintain interest in a limited faction?
So I think one of the best ways is getting to know your faction very well and all the different kind of structures you can put within the list, different little pods of things that work well together. And I think that's always fun to try the same, basically like group of things, but with a new caster. I like testing things repeatedly. I also think that when you're playing a limited faction, it's interesting, and what I enjoy about it is playing against what is good. So I might play the same things, but my opponents are going to be playing different things, whether they're changing between factions or within the faction themselves. Like if there's a new CID for Crix and they get a whole bunch of new stuff, now it's going to be a new experience to play against that Crix caster or that Crix player. And I find that really interesting because even though my things will perform the same and maybe work the same, but having my opponent's stuff change is still interesting to me to figure out how I'm going to play into them and maybe use tools that I didn't use previously because of the changes that they received.
All right, so next question from BCCB, he says, have you seen a shift in the ratio of solos to units in Convergent lists since the 2021 update?
No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty much the same. I think that not many of the solos in Convergence got anything that's going to make you start bringing them more. And I don't think the units did either. No, I think that pretty much stayed the same. I don't think that there was any big shifts there.
All right, so final question from BCCB. He says, what are your thoughts on the perception and comments concerning a diminishing player base for War Machine and Hordes? Are they justified in your meta?
Yes, they are, I think, in my meta. So I actually a little bit further north of Salt Lake, and here we've had a pretty consistent group of just about 4 of us, and we're still all playing. But south in Salt Lake City itself, they used to have a community of 30, 40 players that were consistent and we'd see all the time. And now they're down to like 10. They've taken a rather big hit with their player base, and that's for various reasons with COVID and with some decisions that Privateer Press has made. I think that the biggest issue is availability of products and not having a good on-ramp for new players. I think that's something Privateer has struggled with for a couple of years. It's not like anything new, but between that and the pandemic, it's really at least hurt my kind of local scene. But we have had many people leave the game, and we haven't really had anyone new come in.
Yeah, I mean, it has been kind of an unfortunate conflux of things of, the pandemic, the end of the press gang, the game kind of reaching a critical mass where it feels like it is really difficult for new players to assimilate into the game because there's just so much to take in.
Yeah, there. I think it's a couple of things, and it's not all pandemic related, but it sure doesn't help. I
Yeah.
think that Privateer has made some questionable decisions. I think stopping all of their weekly content that they were doing and stopping the Henchhold scrolls when they did, those are things that they decided to do that they could have kept doing in the pandemic. A pause definitely warranted for sure during a pandemic to say, oh, can we keep doing these things? But they took a 2-year break when it maybe could have been a 2-month break before they go, oh yeah, we can just record these things from home or whatever the situation might have been. And when people are stuck at home really thirsting for some content, they weren't putting any out. I think that they did not do themselves any favors with how they stopped all of their content during the pandemic. And it was a little bit understandable, but I think overall was probably a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, really, the kind of the crux of it is that there's always going to be an attrition of players that leave a game due to life circumstances or changing interests, etc. And so there always has to be an influx of new players, or else there's going to be a decreasing player base. And it is just pretty difficult right now for new players to gain access into the game. So I'm sure it's something that Privateer Press is thinking about and trying to come up with solutions to.
If they come up with a good on-ramp for new players, I would not be surprised to see Privateer Press and Warmachine and Hordes come roaring back to be super successful game, like maybe even more so than they've ever been. But they've got to do a little bit of work to get that ball rolling, and then hopefully it'll take off and we'll see worldwide growth across the game.
All right. Well, it's time to shift gears and start asking questions from Benup. As always, his first question is how to win cock. And then he says, I'm an adult, I swear.
So, consent and clean play. That's how you win. You make sure that everyone knows what your intentions are and you talk things out before proceeding with your actions. That's my tip for winning with cock.
All right. Next question from Ben Up. He says, post mega update, how are you feeling about the faction?
I think it feels great. Like I said, I think it's probably towards the top end. It's not overpowered. Actually, probably one of my personal gripes is when Strength Bedfellows was at the height of being so good, is you got a lot of those faction jumpers, right? That follow whatever the new hotness is. And I was happy to be playing really competitive lists and doing well. But part of me was just like, man, I wish all of these power gamers would get out of my faction. Like, they're going to ruin this. They're going to take things away because they're just going to push the envelope too far. And that's what happened, obviously. And it probably would have happened anyway. It's just the nature of how the game works. But I do think that they're in a really good position. And I'm also glad that I don't have a bunch of power gamers whose attitudes maybe I don't agree with telling me how to play a faction I've been playing for, 8 years.
It is sort of interesting that the way things kind of lined up with Strange Bedfellows was that a lot of the game that was being played was done online, and so it was a lot easier to make this these wacky kind of spammy sometimes Strange Bedfellow lists without having to invest money into buying the models.
Yeah, I think with Tesselators and stuff as well.
Yeah, and there is, I guess, a little bit of a part of me that there's obviously if there are things in the game that are that would be considered quote unquote broken if a bunch of people were playing it, then it gets fixed. But if there's something that could or would be considered unbalanced, but no one is playing it, then in general it just kind of slides under the radar and doesn't get a change. And I'm kind of curious if it hadn't been pandemic times, and if online wasn't as big of a component as it was, if Strange Bedfellows would have, kind of flown under the radar and not gotten the attention that it did.
Yeah, it's like, what does the meta look like when everyone has infinite money to buy whatever models anytime that they want? Yeah. I think Strange Bedfellows' other big problem, though, isn't just that. I do think that is probably valid, but that it's in 3 different factions.
Yeah, I think that it likely would have. I think that actually Mercenaries probably would have been the faction that got Strange Bedfellows nerfed, even if it wasn't an online mostly game. But
so it actually affects 4 factions, right? Because you got Nemo and Signar, and then Asphyxious and Crix, and then Mercenaries. I think that I haven't said this so far, but I do think that the Strange Bedfellows being a mercenary list is a really big mistake. I think that is something that Privateer Press should have never done. And I said so much in the CID, and I was told to stop bringing it up or I would get banned. So I did, but I do think that there's no way for them to unring that bell effectively. Right. They want to invalidate all those mercenary players who purchased into Strange Bedfellows. But I do think that the reasoning behind it was really, really quite weak. And if it had only been a Convergence list or a Convergence and Crix list, I think it would have been probably less problematic than when you have it being able to be paired with the powerhouse that is Mercenaries now. Like, Mercenaries have so many strong things, and then you just give them another strong thing. I think that was one of the biggest problems.
Yeah, I know as a retailer, these like Asphyxious and Nemo and Aurora, these new models, they're all merchandise as mercenary models, and it just seems kind of strange to me, because in a lot of ways it feels like that's the weakest part of both their fluff and how they look, and basically just everything. And so I don't know, in a lot of ways it did kind of feel like it was more of a financially based decision than one that was off of game mechanics or fluff.
Yeah, I agree. I think the fluff argument was paper thin at best. It was borderline absurd. But I am happy that many people got to play Strange Bedfellows and Auroras. I think that overall, maybe it was a really good business decision, but I think for my happiness as a Convergence player or for a quality of the game, maybe not the best decision they could have made.
And I feel very confident that they sold a lot more of the product because of the decision, and so in that regards, it was a successful decision.
Right. I want Privateer Press to stay in business. I want them to keep making products and keep the game going. Right. So if that's the price I've got to pay, then so be it.
All right. Well, we're going to pause here, and the next follow-up question we have is actually more questions on Strange Bedfellows, so stay tuned for that. As always, I want to remind everyone to check out discountgamesinc.com for your gaming needs. We also have some updates on the tournament list that you guys can check out. As always, thank you to the patrons who help make the podcast possible. And finally, Dustin, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, if I could just real quick plug, I have a YouTube channel that I'm going to start putting battle reports on, and it's just Not a Real Faction on YouTube, and I'll be putting up my games from the VTC and hopefully more in-person games in the future.
Awesome. So check out that YouTube channel and you can see some sweet content. So thanks again, everyone, for listening, and have a good day.